Good afternoon to you. I am going to spend a few minutes describing to you a type of virtue theory I have been working on that I call exemplarist virtue theory, or just exemplarism. The general idea of the theory is that basic moral concepts, all the basic moral concepts like virtue, right act, good motive, good aim, good life, can all be defined via direct reference to exemplars of moral goodness picked out through the emotion of admiration. I first proposed a version of this theory, a Christian version of it, in my 2004 book that's called Divine Motivation Theory. That book was long and rather complicated. It had a whole lot of philosophical theology in it and a lot of stuff about the metaphysics of morals. And subsequently, I decided that I would like to write the theory in its more general form and for a different audience, a more general audience. I also had conversations with psychologists and philosophers of education, educators who were interested in it. And so I wanted to incorporate some of that work into it. So that's the idea. Now, the book isn't done. I have another Templeton grant for next year, so I'm giving you just an overview of the theory, and then I want, because there's not much time, I'm just going to focus on the emotion of admiration at the end. I'm going to ask you some questions about it, because I'm not happy with what I have figured out about admiration. So let me start with what I think is the point of a moral theory. The basic point of a moral theory is a philosophical one, to give an abstract structure that simplifies, systematizes, and justifies our moral beliefs and practices. That, I think, is really the point of a moral theory. It's a philosophical purpose. And if a theory does that, that's wonderful. However, many moral educators are disappointed with philosophical ethics because it doesn't seem to have a lot to do with motivating people to be good. And so I also have, in my theory, a practical purpose. So it's designed to help us make moral decisions. It's particularly designed to motivate us. The motivator is actually in the theory and at the foundation of the theory. And so the theory is supposed to not only be an abstract structure, but it's supposed to help us, to make us motivated to be good, like the exemplars. A third aim is to link the a priori side of ethics with empirical studies. There, as everybody at this conference knows, there's been a lot of discussion about the need for philosophical work to be sensitive to empirical studies. This theory is designed to not only be responsive to such studies, but to actually incorporate those studies into the theory itself. Now let me say something more about the structure, like what I think, how I think of a theory. I said it's a structure that simplifies and systematizes our moral beliefs and practices. So I think of a theory as like a map of a geographical area. It is an abstract structure, but it aims at giving understanding, and it can only do that by simplifying what it maps. So if you think about, say, a city map, the map would be useless. It would not give us understanding of the layout of the city if everything in the city was on the map. So it serves the purpose of aiding understanding by simplifying. So it has to simplify. It has to leave things out. Furthermore, what's left in is sometimes distorted, and that actually can be an aid to understanding. So again, if you think about a map, the streets, the lines on the map that depict the streets are often straighter than they really are in real life. That's good because it's just easier to picture it in your mind if it's distorted in a way that simplifies. Sometimes the distortion is even more extreme than that. So think about a two-dimensional map of the world, how the countries at the poles, the size and the shape of the countries is way off, right? It's way distorted. That does no harm as long as we're aware of it. And even with such distortion, we often may find a two-dimensional map of the world more useful than a globe is. So I'm saying all this to let you know what I'm doing. I mean, I'm going to simplify. I'm going to simplify a lot, and there will be some distortion. And I'm thinking of what I'm presenting as a map. There are better maps and worse maps. There can be more than one good map, but I'm giving you a map, okay, which I hope is a good map. Here's a disanalogy between maps and moral theories. Maps don't attempt to justify, only to depict what they map, whereas a moral theory does attempt to justify what it depicts. So we might decide when we have our theory, the theory might actually, because of the way it simplifies, it may actually reveal to us anomalies in our moral practices that we need to change. It may lead us to change, say, something about practices of, say, punishment, or it may lead us to make some changes in our judgments about the virtues, something of that sort. That's fine. On a map, we don't do that. I mean, a map of a geographical area. I mean, you can imagine a map that we like so much that it led us to move the streets around just to make it fit the map better. But we don't do that, okay? So that's a disanalogy. I might have to skip this. Yeah, so a map is primarily, I think of a map as primarily intended to give understanding of a domain. It can also be used to navigate, but not all maps are used to navigate. I mean, a map of the world, you don't really get anywhere by looking at a map of the world. But my map will be used, at least in part, to help us navigate the moral domain. I'm going to skip that. Okay, now, let me say something about foundationalist theories. Foundationalism, I think of foundationalism as a theory in which the theory is constructed out of a single element. So there's a single element which is then used, all other elements in the map or in the theory are defined in terms of that single element, which we call the foundational element. In epistemology, foundationalism has been in disrepute for some time. But in moral theory, I think there's great advantages in foundationalism because, well, foundationalism has advantages of simplicity and elegance, and when you have a domain as messy as the moral domain, it helps a lot to streamline it as much as possible. And if you can get away with a map that serves the purposes of theory, a map of the moral domain that serves the purposes I've described with a single element at the foundation, then that's even better. That'd be great. However, foundationalist theories that you can think of have concepts at the foundation. Because after all, a map or theory is a conceptual structure. So of course, a concept's going to be at the foundation, you might think. And so we might have the concept of human well-being or happiness or goodwill. I'm not actually suggesting necessarily that Kant was a foundationalist, but let's leave that aside. But you have some concept at the foundation, and then everything else is sort of built up out of that single concept. Now, it's not going to be any surprise that when you do that, most of the attention is going to be focused on that foundational concept, because if that element is wrong, then the whole thing falls apart, right? Now, my suggestion is not to oppose any of those kinds of theories. I like lots of them, especially the human well-being one. But I want to do something different. So it doesn't have the same, it's foundationalist, but it doesn't have a conceptual foundation. The foundation is not a concept at all, but it's an object, it's a thing, or a set of things. The foundation is exemplars of moral goodness. Now, to explain how this theory is constructed, I need to bring you back to a theory that many of you know about, but maybe some of you don't know about, which is the well-known theory of direct reference, which became famous in the 70s, particularly in the form in which Hilary Putnam and Saul Kripke proposed it. to see what was revolutionary, I mean, this created a revolution in semantics, and in order to see what was revolutionary about it, it would be good to say a couple little things, very, very schematic, about what it was opposed to, like what preceded it. So the prevailing view at the time was that if you understand the meaning of a word, a general word like, say, like hammer, the meaning is a description in your head. So basically the meaning of hammer is what the dictionary would say. So you understand the meaning of hammer if this description of what a hammer is in your head. So it might be something like, I don't know, I'm going to make this up, but like heavy tool with a handle that you can use to drive in nails or something like that. And you grasp the meaning when you grasp that description. And then you succeed in referring to hammers and can have beliefs about hammers, make assertions about hammers, as long as there are objects in the world that fit that description. So when you say hammer, the meaning is in your head, and it's descriptive, and you are talking about objects that fit that description. So that's how you're able to talk about hammers. Now that way of thinking about meaning and reference worked pretty well for some terms, like hammers. But it didn't work very well for certain other terms. In particular, it would seem to be a complete failure for proper names. And besides that, and even more interestingly, I think, there are some general terms that it just doesn't seem to fit at all. In particular, natural kind terms, terms for naturally occurring elements or species. And what Kripke and Putnam suggested was that the meaning of those terms is not a description in your head. You might have some description in your head, but the description could be wrong, or it could be, in any case, it doesn't matter. The description is not the meaning. Instead, what you mean by natural kind terms like gold and water is what we've got up here. Gold is whatever is the same element as that, and you point to some gold. Water is whatever is the same liquid as that. Human is whatever is a member of the same species as that, and so on, okay? So the idea is, let's see if I need to, okay. The idea is that the meaning of the term is not a description. It isn't that you don't have some descriptions of water and gold, but you don't mean by water. The meaning of water is not colorless, flavorless liquid that's in the lakes and the streams. That's not the meaning of water. What you mean by water is whatever has the same deep structure as that stuff there. That's what you mean by water. And how do you find out what that deep structure is? Is that something you have in your head? No, you have to find out by looking. So what this meant is that the meanings of terms are, we succeed in referring to water not by referring through a description. We might not have a description, or in any case, whatever description we have is not the meaning. And once we succeed in picking out the things that we want to talk about, we can find out what makes them what they are by empirical investigation. So this theory explains some interesting things. First of all, it explains how we can succeed in referring to a thing without going through a description that picks out what the thing is. We find out what makes a thing the kind of thing it is by investigation, by observation. And then even more interestingly, Kripke proposed that what we find out when we investigate the structure of water, gold, so et cetera, could be a necessary truth even though it's empirical, even though it's discovered a posteriori. So this is what he said, like take water as H2O. Kripke suggested it's a necessary truth, that is to say, nothing's water unless it's H2O. H2O is what makes this stuff water. It's discovered, obviously people did not know water was H2O for millennia. So it's empirical, but it's a necessary truth. However, there is an a priori element in this that I think Keith Donnellan pointed out a long time ago, and I think this is correct. It still has to be a priori that when we talk about water, when we say water, and we say it's stuff like that, we don't mean stuff that's superficially like that. We mean stuff that has the same deep nature, this deep structure of that stuff. So we know a priori that whatever the basic structure of water is necessary to it. But what we know a posteriori is that the basic structure of water is H2O. And so that's how it is that we find out that water is H2O, and what we find out is something that is necessary. Now, that's the 5-minute version of the theory of direct references applied to natural kind terms, and I want to use this in constructing a moral theory. So, what I'm suggesting is that the foundation of this theory is not a concept, but it's exemplars of moral goodness to which we refer directly. So, good persons are persons like that, just like water is stuff like that. Okay? There are lots of examples of exemplars already embedded in our moral practices, the practices the theory is depicting, right, is explaining and justifying. So, for example, Confucius, Jesus, St. Francis, Stoic sages, Greek heroes, lots of people like this, okay? So, in the same way that we can, that water does not refer through a descriptive meaning, I'm suggesting that good person does not refer through a descriptive meaning. We don't have to associate a particular descriptive meaning with good person. We might even associate the wrong description with good person. And we can still succeed in grasping the meaning of good person and succeed in talking about good persons. Just as we can grasp the meaning of water and succeed in talking about water before we know it's H2O. Okay? How do we identify the exemplars? I'm suggesting is through the emotion of admiration. This emotion is subject to education, through experience, through the emotional reactions of other people, but that is, I'm suggesting, that is the way, the ultimate way, the basic way we identify exemplars. It's through the emotion of admiration. What is the emotion of admiration? I'm going to ask you later to tell me more about what you think it is. I think of admiration as being a basic emotion, so you can't analyze it in terms of something else that's more basic. But we can say something about it. And one thing I would say about it is that it's an emotion that's, well, it's positive. It's directed towards something that's found attractive. And it's attractive in a way that makes the object of admiration appear to be imitable or deserving of emulation. This doesn't mean that we imitate or even try to imitate or want to imitate every admirable person, certainly not. There's got to be the right circumstances and so on. But there is something in the emotion of admiration that is motivating. It actually does have within it a motivating force to want to be like the persons we admire. So one thing I've left out completely is my theory of what an emotion is. But I think of an emotion like admiration as being directed at an object that's seen a certain way in the particular emotion. So in the emotion of admiration, the object is seen as admirable. If the emotion survives reflection, then we actually may judge that the person is admirable. But the emotion itself has within it a motive to be like or to imitate or emulate the admirable person or the person we admire. This is not to say that our judgment of exemplars cannot be revised. They can be revised. Well, there's more than one reason why they can be revised. First of all, our emotions themselves may change over time, and as I said, they can be educated. But what is more likely to happen is that once we investigate the set of persons we call exemplars, we may find out that some of them are outliers. We may find out that some of them really don't have the features. Upon further investigation, we cease to admire them. So the same thing happens or can happen with gold and water. There aren't too many liquids that are like water, but gold, there is fool's gold, as you probably know. And you might think, in your initial set of instances of gold, you might include some fool's gold. Upon investigation, you find out that some of these things really aren't the same element as the others. So some of them you throw out of the set. I think the same thing happens, or I'm suggesting the same thing happens with exemplars. Upon investigation, we may find out that there are certain psychological structures, like chemical structures, analogous to chemical structures, that the exemplars have in common, but some of them don't have it. Or, there's various reasons why you might think some of these exemplars really aren't exemplars after all, and we may change our judgments. Okay. I suggested to you, or told you anyway, that one of the interesting features of Kripke's version of the theory of direct reference is that there are necessary a posteriori truths, that empirical investigation can reveal the natures of things. And the example, of course, standard examples, water is H2O. Similarly, it could turn out that empirical investigation can reveal what makes a good person good, just as empirical investigation can reveal what makes water water or gold gold. And if to pursue this analogy, if we know a priori that the deep structure of water is what makes it water, we might also know a priori that the deep nature of persons is what makes them good persons. The deep nature of good persons is what makes them good. What's the deep nature? Well, I'm going to suggest that we know a priori that it's something psychological. I mean, it's nothing superficial. It's not something about their external appearance or even behavior, but it's something, it has to do with their psychological structure. That would be parallel to saying we know in advance that what makes water water is not a certain being colorless and odorless. It's whatever its chemical structure is. That's what makes it water. And of course, it's possible that upon investigation, we find that some putative kind is really not a natural kind, that it's just a hodgepodge of things. So it could turn out that there is no commonality at all in the psychological structure of the people that we call good persons, picked out through admiration. But I suspect there's a lot of commonality. That's why I'm proposing this theory. Now, so if we know a priori that what makes a good person good is something in their psychological structure, we can find out what that is by observation, just as we can find out that water is H2O by observation. Now, what I mean by observation includes narratives. Narratives do count for me as a kind of extended observation. So we have a whole history of observations of exemplars in biographies and in fact fictions. I mean, fictional exemplars I think are important also. So we have narratives that are forms of a detailed observations of exemplars. By studying those narratives, we can find out various psychological traits that they have. We can find out what they aim at. We can find out what they desire. There's all kinds of things we can find out that I want to suggest are important in constructing this theory. I myself have been looking at some stories of saints and heroes, Holocaust rescuers. I mean, you probably know about some of these books. Catherine Spink has a nice book, biography of Jean Vanier in the L'Arche communities, which now exist in hundreds of countries where people live with people who have mental disabilities. Some of these people have lived in these communities with these disabled people for extended periods of time, many years. And it's interesting to look at their biographies and look at the stories of what motivates them and what kinds of traits they have. So I'm counting narratives as being empirical. It's a form of observation. But in addition to that, there's empirical research in the laboratory and psychological studies. In the last, maybe 5 years, I've been a consultant for a multidisciplinary group that does research in the laboratory on exemplars. I mean, they actually put these people on these fMRI machines and have them play these rescuer games and various kinds of economics games. So there's studies now, at least that I know of some of them, going on in the laboratory and in psychological studies as well. And these studies, I think, actually do the kind of thing I'm talking about, where empirical investigation of people identified as exemplars can fill out the content of the theory. So what I'm suggesting is a structure, and the content is provided by empirical investigation. So here's a brief summary. An exemplar is a paradigmatically good person, a person who's most admirable. We identify admirable persons by the emotion of admiration. Good persons are persons like that, those we admire. A person admirable in some respect is imitable in that respect, and admiration gives us the motive to imitate them. What I left out, what should be on there at the end, is that we find out what respect we admire them by investigation. So by investigation, we can find out the traits of the exemplars, the kinds of behaviors they engage in, what sorts of acts they consider appropriate, what they aim at, and so on, okay? Now, let me go back quickly, since this is just an overview of this theory, and I just want you to see how it's supposed to serve all three of these aims. The philosophical aim is a theory in which all the basic concepts are defined via direct reference to exemplars of moral goodness. I have not given you the definitions of each term, much less defended them, but I want you to see how, get an idea of how this is supposed to work. So the idea is roughly virtues are traits of those persons, right acts are acts that those persons would do or would think that they have most reason to do in some set of circumstances. A good life, a life those persons desire. That's the idea. So the concepts of most interest to ethics are defined by examination of the exemplars. The practical motive, I hope you can see why that motive is is intended to be served by this theory. The motive to be moral, which I'm claiming is admiration, is at the foundation of the theory. It's that emotion that gets the theory started. So the theory has the motive in the foundation. It also satisfies the aim of incorporating empirical studies, and it does this in a very robust sense because the features of all I give you is a structure, and the features of the exemplars are filled in empirically. Now let me end by asking you some questions about admiration. I have found very little work on admiration. There is some stuff by Jonathan Haidt, which I find a little peculiar because he uses the term admiration only for people who are highly talented, and then for people who are morally exemplary, he uses the term elevation for that emotion. Seems to me admiration is a perfectly good word for the emotion that we direct towards morally exemplary people. So I don't care for the changing the terms. But there is something interesting, and I think right, about what Haidt says, which is if you look at the people that we consider exemplary, or the people most admirable, don't say morally exemplary, just people who are most admirable, some of them seem to be in the wrong category to fit into a moral theory, okay? Some of them are geniuses. I mean, they're just highly talented people, musical geniuses, intellectual geniuses, and so on. Talent is not going to work for this. It might work for certain purposes, but not for this particular, not for the purposes of constructing a moral theory. So I'm leaving geniuses out. I also think that that's not an ad hoc move, because it seems to me that the feeling I have confronted with genius is different than the feeling I have when confronted with morally exemplary qualities. But you can tell me if you agree with me or not. Saints and heroes, there is some bit of work on saints and heroes, both philosophical papers and then biographies and that sort of thing. And that stuff I like. I think that those are the sorts of people that we admire in the relevant sense. Heroes are a little bit peculiar in one way, that heroes, often what makes a person heroic applies only to a certain limited range of their life, a limited range of their behavior. So heroes might, I mean, if you look at biographies of Holocaust rescuers, some of them have some obvious vices that have nothing to do with the rescuing activities. So they're not necessarily overall exemplars. That's okay, though. I mean, the theory can be modified for that kind of situation. Now, here's a harder one, sages. Now, it would be really, I think, unacceptable to have a moral theory where Confucius doesn't count as an exemplar. So there's got to be, sages are exemplars, but sages have, I'm not always thinking the same line on this, but part of the time I think sages are hard to emulate. I mean, Confucius isn't that hard to emulate because he's a certain kind of sage. So my colleague Amy Oberding wrote this nice book on exemplarism in the Analects, and she argues that the moral theory of the Analects is a theory like this, an exemplarist theory. And Confucius is the exemplar, and he can be imitated. Or emulated is actually a better word. And Confucius himself emulated the Duke of Zhou. Okay, that's fine, but then for some other sages, like, I don't know, maybe Father Zosima and the brothers Karamazov, he's more of a sage that he sort of gives people advice when people come and ask him questions, and he speaks sagely, right? But I don't know if you can emulate him. So I want to say I'm not sure what to say about sages. But let me say, though, that this is a problem for the motivational part of the theory, incorporating the motivation into the theory. It's actually not a problem for the theoretical part. So it could still be that the moral concepts are all defined via direct reference to exemplars, and sages count in that category. But this is a problem for the motivation. So let me just end by saying I'd like to hear from you what you think admiration is. Are there different kinds? And what emotion do you think is most appropriate for exemplars? Thank you.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I won't. It will. 1.
Okay, so thank you for that. That was sort of uplifting, and I admire you for it. So I wanted to ask what admiration is for, and I wonder here if, I mean, at the end you say this is just sort of a problem of implementation, and it doesn't really reflect on the actual theory, right? How we understand admiration. Admiration plays a certain role in the theory, and then specifically how it works out, those are kind of details.
Well, I meant that there might be kinds of admiration.
Okay.
So some kinds might fit the theory and other kinds don't.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, I mean, one reason perhaps why heroes are fit for emulation, but geniuses are not, is because just as humans, what we tend to imitate are overt behaviors, right? So heroes do stuff. They slay dragons, right? They rescue people. Like, you can pretend, like, act that out. I mean, what do geniuses do? They like sit around and they have these brilliant ideas, right? Now, maybe an artistic genius, you can sort of pretend, but even here, children will paint on a canvas, but they're not going to imitate Einstein as he came up with theory of relativity. So I wonder then if the role of admiration, sort of like ideologically, isn't just to get children to imitate what people around them, especially adults, do. And why would this be sort of the ideology of admiration? Well, because as human culture has become more complex, more sophisticated, right, we have to interact with artifacts of greater and greater sophistication. And one really good way to sort of learn how to manipulate artifacts, navigate the sort of social structure, is just to do what the adults around you do. And this is actually borne out by a lot of evidence in developmental literature on what's called over-imitation. Like, you can get children to imitate you, do all kinds of crazy things. And you say, all right, I'm going to use this tool, or I'm going to operate this system. Now, the backside is going to come a gumball. And you say, I'm
Since
going
you're
to
actually more to your point, or because there are a lot of people,
Oh.
people waiting, so if you ask your
Sure.
question, maybe you could let Linda answer.
Okay, so proposal, what role does admiration play? It gets children to imitate adults so that they can be competent navigating social and cultural world.
Okay, yeah, okay, this, I mean, I have a whole lot to say, so I'm going to try and figure out a quick thing to say. There's a difference between a theory of the genealogy of morals, how moral concepts are acquired by children. There's a difference between that and a moral theory as I've described it. So I am trying to give a theory. However, I think it maps fairly well with psychological development because we do learn many things by imitation. However, I think, initially you seem to be concerned about imitating behaviors as opposed to imitating, wasn't that your initial worry, that children just mimic? There's a difference between pure imitation and emulation. And what I actually think is that exemplars are deserving of emulation, and they elicit from us emulation. It's not just rote imitation. Now, how that actually connects with the way children learn moral concepts, we'll have to talk about that later, because it's not exactly the same thing.
Number two?
Yeah, I'm interested in this other function of admiration. You mentioned that admiration serves the epistemological function of helping us ID exemplars. But doesn't it also have a different function, a normative function, that connotes approval or admiration of somebody's character or their traits or what it is they're trying to do? And can't we, in that sense, admire somebody who's, say, a perpetrator of great evil? I'm thinking here of David Lewis's paper, Divine Evil, where he talks a lot about admiring people who perpetrate great evil and how that itself conducts evil to the person who admires the perpetrator of great evil. And in that kind of a case, there is no sense in which you want to imitate necessarily what the person is doing. You just approve of it. He has a kind of neo-Nazi example of somebody called Fritz, who admires Hitler's final solution, but who himself would never do anything to hurt a Jew.
Okay, let me make sure I understand the objection, because
I'm not sure it's an objection. I'm just trying to tease out a different sense of
because
admiration.
there is a sense in which you might admire something, knowing it to be evil, and you would never do it.
But approving of it. It's not so much that you know it to be evil, you approve of it, but you'd never do it. You regard it as somebody else's job to do, not yours.
Oh.
And so, in that sense, I think that you could normatively approve of somebody, admire somebody's project, but never yourself want to do it.
Okay. And the reason you wouldn't want to do it is because you judge it's evil?
Oh no, you judge that it's their thing. It's what they're doing. Right? Like, the vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. You don't seek vengeance yourself, but you approve of the vengeance.
Okay, so
You admire it.
yeah, there's two things that I'm trying to distinguish here, because you can, first of all, you can admire something that is not in fact admirable because it's evil. And you just, you admire the Nazi, and you yourself are a Nazi, and that, and that's one kind of issue to be discussed. But I'm not sure about the fact that you don't always do yourself what you approve of or what you admire is actually another point. Because I'm not denying that there are many things I admire and would not do myself because I don't have the right role or something of that sort, or the circumstances aren't right. I admire Sir Robert Falcon Scott for his expedition to the South Pole, and I think that was wonderful. I have no desire whatsoever to go to the South Pole. And I don't think there's any conflict between admiring him and having no desire. But there is something I want to imitate. I can't say exactly what it isn't the expedition itself. It's being the kind of person who could do something like that. So I'm not sure. I think we're going to have to follow up on this because I think there's two different points that need different kinds of answers, and I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Number three. Are you three? Who's three?
Oh, you're seven.
I'm not sure
Where's
which
three?
area. Maybe we're
One of those two is three.
Are you three?
Okay. Two quick questions.
Now we're forever holding.
Two quick questions. First, I was just curious what you could say about the other half, kind of vices and negative exemplars.
Yeah, good. I
and
like this, yeah.
Revulsion as
Yeah,
a kind of
yeah,
admiration. And the second kind of about kind of how the reference gets off the ground. There are two questions about that. First, Kripke's and Hutton's, if I'm not mistaken, is really a theory of how proper names or category terms get their reference. It's a genealogical theory. So does the analogy to your theory suggest that yours is a genealogical theory rather than a conceptual?
Okay, let me try and separate this. Your
Right.
first question, remind me again the first question.
About the others.
Oh, yeah, the negative
Axis
ones.
rather, yeah.
Okay,
I'm
so.
going to put a limit here and say people are permitted to
Oh, no,
ask
loud
only
one.
one question.
Okay, I'll answer one question. Okay, so there are negative exemplars, and unfortunately there are a whole lot more of them than the positive ones. And I do think that we are motivated to not be like, the negative exemplars. And the emotion that we direct towards them is the opposite of admiration, which is probably something like contempt. But the reason the theory isn't constructed around that, well, maybe it's just partly my temperament, and usually ethicists talk a lot more about the positive stuff than the negative stuff. But I actually think that even though that's all true, we have negative exemplars, we don't want to be like them, not wanting to be like somebody doesn't give you very specific directions. It tells you what not to do, but that doesn't tell you what to do. The positive exemplars actually give you something to emulate, and hopefully, if you investigate them carefully, it gives you something more specific to emulate. But if they're just contemptible, all you know is, I don't want to be like that, and so make sure you don't do that. But that doesn't really tell you much more than that. But could you construct the theory itself around that? Maybe it's possible. It wouldn't be the motivational stuff, but it would be the, I suppose you could do that. Yeah.
Number 4.
Thanks, Linda. So the comparison with natural kind terms, I find it really intriguing, but I'm not sure it's apt. So the way water works is you say something like, water is any stuff like this, whatever the heck this is. We don't even know.
Right.
But good person, this person is good, any person like him or her, whatever the heck that is, that's not the case at all. You could say more about why that person is good. That person is generous, that person is compassionate, that person is honest, which suggests it's in fact a very different thing, that we have a kind of some paradigm of what's good, and then this person falls into that paradigm.
Okay, so the way this map is described, I already know you've been around the map a few times, right? I mean, you've used this map before. So the way this is supposed to go is, I actually think that we can admire people, identify them as admirable in advance of knowing what it is that makes them admirable. That's actually a key point of this whole thing. And we find out what makes them admirable by looking at them more closely. When we do that, we will start making a list. They're generous, kind, blah, 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 blah. Once we do that, of course, our life is easier, because now the next time, we've got something more to go on than simply, I admire this person. I already have a list, at least a hypothesis of some traits of admirable persons that I can use. So in real life, you're already investigating, you're already incorporating that into your stock of methods of identifying exemplars. So I'm not denying that we do what you just said. But I do want to say that the test of whether something is a virtue is going to be, ultimately, is that what we admire. That's the bottom line, is what we admire upon reflection. So I do want to say that, so I guess that's the answer.
I'm going to allow number 5 quickly.
This is really exciting and promising. I'm really excited. And I'm in a project of trying to get psychologists to do something like what you're saying. And the recommendation is going to depend a lot on the number of people that qualify as exemplars. So you started with, Jesus and people of that rarity. Then you added Holocaust rescuers and so forth, which are also extremely rare. Do you think it gets beyond that? Could you say a percentage, 1%, 10%?
You want to know what the percentage of people in the world are exemplars?
I want you to, yes, I want you to give me your hunch. I want you to give me your hunch of the percentage. Is it more like 0.5%? Is it more like 10%? Or is it more like is it less than 0.5%?
First of all, a lot of exemplars are fictional, so you got to put them in there too.
Yeah?
Okay, I have no idea.
Oh.
I mean, I don't know how to answer this question.
Is it more like Jesus? Or
All that yeah, I mean, starting with the super exemplars makes it easier to get the concept of what we're talking about, real admiration, like whatever the extreme of admiration is. And then, you can talk about ordinary admiration, or something that's not directed at something that's exalted, as exalted a being as Jesus. So, yeah, Holocaust rescuers seem pretty good to me. And the Holocaust rescuers and the people in the L'Arche communities, now that's more, they're people who've given up many years of their lives to live with handicapped people and give them a flourishing life. I mean, I find that very admirable. I mean, and there's a lot of people like that. I have no idea what the percentage is, but you don't really have to run into them every day to have stories about them that you know about, that you can use, I think, both in motivating you and in getting ideas of what the good life is.
It's a lot harder to do research if it's less than.
Yeah, because you have to find these people. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, of course, they're already looking at the people in the L'Arche community, so. Yeah, okay.